process. Of course, that becomes a lot more difficult when you start doing it because it's not that simple. You know, anybody can figure out how to do a form tag, but then you've got to validate, then you've got to try to create some of these other features and make sure it works. And doing all that, I came to really appreciate what HTML5 offers versus what we've been doing currently with HTML. And so that's where I want to go with this, so that if you are working on some of the web coding in your library, then hopefully this will show you some of these things that you can use. If you are wanting to go in that direction, like I know there was a gentleman the other day talking about web apps versus native apps for mobile devices, and they use HTML5 for the mobile devices because it incorporates, those mobile device browsers usually incorporate a lot of HTML5 functionality, particularly what I'll get to, video and audio, which is great for example iPhone, which of course everybody knows Steve Jobs made that comment about not going with Flash and wanting to stay with HTML5. So I want to talk a little bit about that too. So I guess I'll go ahead and just jump in and start talking about the why of HTML5. Why is it even important? Why do they consider it? And there are generally two reasons that I've been able to figure why we want to move to using HTML5 more robustly than we do. One, semantics. Not to try to get too deep into the history of like web development and all that and just make everybody's eyes glaze over about stuff that's slightly off topic. You know, when Tim Berners-Lee came up with HTML, the real innovation wasn't so much the markup language that had been around. Markup language has been around for a while, been used in software like word processing programs and things like that. The real innovation, of course, was the addressing system combined with the hyperlink. And that was what moved it forward. That's what sort of created the web on the internet, that concept of hyperlinking this addressing system that he created. So, you know, if you, I guess, think about War Games, the old Matthew Broderick film, that was the internet pre-Tim Berners-Lee. You know, you dialed into a computer, you looked for the files on that computer or that network, you had to download it, and it was basically sealed off from everybody else except people who were heavy into computer science. The ability to create a document that can then link to other documents on the internet opened it up for everybody else. And as that happened, it started to evolve in ways that they didn't anticipate. People wanted to be able to use the web as they did, and it exploded as a publishing platform. And in order to do that, the functionality of the HTML, they strained it. They pushed its boundaries, and I'll talk about that. And if you guys are familiar with doing a lot of the web coding, like actually looking at the HTML, you know, you got the div problem, right? You look at a web page, and it's 2,400 divs with IDs and classes and things like that, and that's the way you would create your style. And I'll go over that in a little bit. What HTML5 does is it has over 20 new structural elements that are purely structural. That purely, this is just a sample of some of the highlights I'll be discussing, but there's a lot more on the website consortium site. And I'll get to that too. I guess HTML, what's driving the development of HTML5 is the W3C, the consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, started by Tim Berners-Lee, plus another group of people who sort of split off called the Web Applications Working Group, or WWIG is what it looks like to me. Over the past few years, they were trying to improve HTML4 at different angles. The W3C was going with XML, trying to make more of a rigid structure that a lot of people didn't like because apparently it was breaking web pages and other things. And the Web Applications Working Group was working on what now became HTML5. Back in 2009, the World Wide Web Consortium signed on with the working group and abandoned XML. And so everybody who deals with creating these standards as of the past couple of years is 100% HTML5. There's nothing else. There's no other language that somebody's trying to, like XML. You don't have to try to worry about compatibility between like XML or XGML or anything like that. If you're HTML5, that's pretty much every standard that's coming out. And enough of them have developed, and the browser support is there, that we can start talking about actually practically using it. So anyway, back to the semantic and structural elements that are created. Well, now, with HTML5, instead of having to create a page that looks something, let's see, like this, if I can find it. Okay, we'll get this up here. That's our style. We'll go down here to our body, and we'll take a look. Should be able to see that. Instead of coming up with, let's see, can this point? Okay, you know, like the div ID, right? Your div ID wrapper, your div ID header, your div ID sidebar, your div ID nav. All that is semantically meaningless to the web browser. It helps you style that element. It helps you put it where you want to on the web page. And so we'll take a quick look at that. Let's see, what is that? We'll use Opera. I'm going to use Opera for my demonstration today. I'm using Opera and Chrome, the latest versions of both of those, because those have the most HTML5 support, and I'll talk about support a little bit later. So, and I think that was example.html. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so it's just like a skeleton of that web development right there, of that web program. So you see, you know, oh, there's my div ID header, my div ID main content, my div ID sidebar. And that's semantically meaningless to the web browser, to the machine, right? Because it just sees div, 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 div. Now, what you can do with HTML5, and I'll show you as far as these elements go. Let's see. Now what we can do, HTML5 test, and I'll show you. We actually have the elements that are incorporated into the browser. So we have a tag for header now. We have a tag for navigation now. We have a tag for an aside, which would be your sidebar. We have a tag for article, which would be the main content of a blog or something like that, that would tell the browser or the screen reader, if you have a disabled patron using a website, right, tells the screen reader what that element is. And it's not just div, div, div. So now you actually have, you can put structure and meaning back into the web page where they wanted it to go in the first place. But again, because the styling of the web page seemed to go supersede the value of making it semantically meaningful, people just started creating these blank structural elements just to make the website look pretty. Now you can do both. You have the ability to style that with your CSS, your header, your aside, your nav, and I'll show you the CSS part of that, and it's semantically meaningful. And now why I keep talking about that, why does that matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. One reason is, like I said, I was talking about the machine needs to understand it better, or the machine can understand it better. So, for example, on syndication, RSS feeds. It's easier to create RSS feeds for a machine if it's able to read the tag instead of having to, you know, like create an ID for it or create a certain, like, semantically meaningless thing. I'll talk about another element in a second that's good for that. Search engine optimization, those kinds of things, right? The browser now knows the segments of the web page a lot more easily. Screen readers for disabled patrons. You have a tag called nav now, so that it can go straight to nav, the screen reader, when it reads the elements. That's how it navigates, that's how they navigate around using these screen readers, is by the elements that the computer is able to identify. And I guess lastly, and this is maybe just a personal thing, but I mean, I think it's just cleaner, nicer looking code. You know, if you do like two-hand code and you do enjoy it, it's a cleaner, nicer look to be able to draw it in this way, to be able to create articles, to create a footer instead of having to do this div ID stuff and all that. It's just a cleaner, nicer, easier way to do it, and it's the way it should have been done a long time ago. So there's that. There are these structural elements. There's also on this level of semantics. Let's see if let me go back to my presentation because I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Let's see. All right. So we got these new elements. Okay, I'll stop right there, and then I'll go on to improve. The other reason for moving toward HTML5 is improved functionality. And I'll actually show demonstrations of a lot of this, so that's why I don't have like slides or screen captures or whatever. One thing HTML5 does that I think is great, and the big problem is getting browser support for this kind of thing, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But one thing HTML5 does is it reduces reliance on JavaScript, I guess PHP to some level, pretty much any of your scripting languages that you use to add what I guess has come to be known that Web 2.0 functionality that people want. It reduces the reliance or the need of those things. Now, a lot of this functionality is not going to be 100% across the board with browsers, and so there are going to be some things that, if these are going to be implemented, there are going to have to be some workarounds that I will talk about. But, for example, JavaScript, usually if you do have a form, and I've had to deal with this, you need JavaScript to validate that form, or to show the user, hey, you didn't type in the right email address, that's not a valid email, or hey, you got to fill in this field, you skipped this field, and you don't want to say, if you don't have that JavaScript, then they submit it, and if it doesn't work, then it wipes everything out and they got to start over. So the JavaScript does help you in those areas. HTML5 incorporates that functionality. Some of the form functions that I'll talk about in a little bit actually do validation. So you can, in the form element, type in required, and they can't proceed. If your browser recognizes HTML5, as it should, then they can't proceed. It says it's required. The functionality is put into the browser. You don't have to write a line of JavaScript or copy and paste a bunch of JavaScript that you barely understand, which is usually what happens. It's usually what I do. You know, you end up going to all these different sites and forums and getting ideas and cutting and pasting, and it kind of works. And so, for example, my forms that I created, it took me a long time, I used purely PHP to actually validate it. But that was a very long, complicated thing, and it's hard to adapt. But and I'll show the example of that. But this should reduce the reliance on that. Also, third-party software is a big one. We don't even notice it as much anymore because Flash is so ubiquitous in a lot of these software applications, because that's the way we want to use it. So, you know, it evolves this way. But a lot of these plugins, these third-party pieces of software that actually don't, well, I won't even say plugins, but they don't really work with the browser. They're just separate pieces of software that you install on your machine. You know, every now and then you get that Flash update. Oh, there's a new Adobe Flash. You install Flash on your computer. Whenever the browser hits that Flash tag, that embed tag, it basically gives over that space of functionality to that third-party piece of proprietary software, like Flash, like QuickTime. And so what you're looking at is not anything the browser's doing. The browser's just kind of like letting that go on, and it doesn't have any control over it. And you can't, and it works, and it's functional, but it requires you to have a relationship outside of that browser, and it does reduce the semantic meaning for the browser because that ends up being a black box. So that's another thing that HTML5 enables us to do is the audio and the video tag. Now the browser itself is designed to play audio and video without any other support, without any other kind of software. Now, if it were just that simple, as it turns out, there's a lot of discussion about what standards for the encoding. I don't know if anybody saw the gentleman a couple of days ago did the presentation on his video streaming that he set up for Rutgers or whatever, and we got the eye numbing or the ear numbing and eye glazing spiel about the codec issues and the container formats and all that stuff. That is still an issue, but right now it's still possible to use these audio and video support elements, and with a little bit of work. And so it may involve encoding a file in more than one type. For example, you want an audio file, and I'll show you that. You might want to encode it as an MP3, right? And which is proprietary, but it's ubiquitous everywhere. Or the new OGG container format, the Vorbis, that is a VP8. I'm starting to lose track of a lot of the alphabet soup with that. But you encode it twice. You make your links to it, and pretty much every browser that works, mobile browser, every major browser, Explorer, Chrome, iOS, Safari, Safari for the PC, Opera, Firefox, Mozilla's Dill Firefox, they will all play that file natively, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that. With video, it's a little trickier, but with audio, it really is those two. If you can get those two, you'll pretty much cover all the bases. With video, it might be a little bit trickier, but I'll go over that in a second. So these are the whys. I know it's a little bit more of a in-depth on some of the history and the philosophy of it, but I think it's very important that we understand that functionality, that what drives, like why we want to start using HTML5. It's not just, oh, it's the next new thing, it's the new flavor. In a sense, my experience with it is that it does deliver on sort of that Web 2.0 promise that was made 6-7 years ago and that people started talking about all over the place, like, oh, Web 2.0, like what that means, and you really couldn't figure out some vague concept, and you just knew it had to do with functionality and interactivity with the browser. And there's a lot more that HTML5 does is just not supported that I'm not going to talk about, like dragging and dropping, for example. You can create draggable elements in HTML, so you can just slide it across the page. Geolocation. HTML will read where you are for your site. You don't have to go to, again, like a third-party application for geolocation or anything like that. The web browser will do that for you. A number of different things that are beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here, but that, again, incorporate that functionality that that we use, and reduces the need for a lot of this third-party software and a lot of this extraneous, difficult to manage and code-breaking script that creates problems. And you know, some people actually don't. A surprising number of people, I think the stats somewhere around 10%, people don't have JavaScript enabled on their browsers. And so you lose that too. So being able to incorporate that HTML5 in there, all you got to do is say update to the latest version in your browser, and they can use it. That's much better on the functionality for the user. So for the semantics and the functionality, that's basically why HTML5. And like I said, I went a little long-winded on that. But I wanted to cover the basis of it, what it does, like what the motivation is for it. All right, so how do we implement it? Now that we know why we want to use HTML5 or start using it or be more familiar with the people who are going to be using it, with whom we're going to be working, like the people who do the development for the mobile web apps and things like that. Now that we're able to, now that we know why, let's look at the biggest issue, which is browser support. The implementation issue that is causing the biggest problem right now is getting all the major vendors, all the major browsers online. The people who develop the standards, they're basically all on the same page. The vendors, it's not quite the same thing. So you're going to have different levels of support for different elements, and I'll go into that in a second. But right now, the important thing is that the basic functionality for HTML5, the recognition of the elements that the browser can interpret and display, that's every major browser that exists, mobile, even Internet Explorer 9, and even back to 8 on a couple of these things, but even IE9 has that basic functionality that you need, with actually a caveat, by the way, unfortunately. And if you deal with this, you know, if you ever deal with any of this, I didn't know what people were talking about. I remember a few years ago, I heard people complain about Internet Explorer. I was like, okay, yeah, whatever, they're Microsoft haters or something, which is fine, you know, you got haters. But then I started trying to write stuff for this, and then I'd open it up in Chrome or Firefox. I'm like, wow, it's great, it's beautiful. And then Internet Explorer, it's all over the page. I'm like, what? And you got to go back and work around, and you spend like forever on somebody's forum, and you know, it still remains a problem. Internet Explorer still remains a problem. And for some reason, I guess because they cornered the market on the PCs, somehow you get like that one demographic, the demographic least likely to know anything about computers are the people who rely on Internet Explorer 9. So they're the ones that you always feel compelled to cover, even if you don't have, even if it doesn't work at all or there's not very many people using it, you still got to, well, what about that one person who, you know, would reach the library using Internet Explorer 6 or something like that? And you have to cover that base. On a lot of these, my personal philosophy here, and I don't know, I mean, it's not like I'm in the web development community here, but I would say a lot of these, you can force people to upgrade to the latest version of the browsers if you want them to use the functionality. You know, that's a lot easier than having to install a third-party plugin. But anyway, Internet Explorer 9, Firefox 3.5 up, Chrome 9 up, Opera 10 up, and they keep coming. There's still a lot more development on the horizon. I'm going to show you a couple of websites, and I have a list of references at the end of this to help, but I'll show you a couple of, open up a couple of websites here that will give you an idea of what's out there. The W3 Schools, the consortium, they have a full HTML5 breakdown, which has a lot more in-depth coverage of some of these elements. And, of course, they've got their fun little examples that you can work with and play with and see how it works. You will, of course, need a latest version of a browser. I would recommend, if you do want to mess around with some of these HTML5 elements, Opera and Chrome. Those are the most progressive ones. Those have the most support. Firefox would be third, and then, of course, you got Safari. And for some reason, you know, everybody talks about Apple being progressive, but they're doing their own proprietary thing, too, so they're not really as on board, and Safari is really not as on board as you would think with some of these things, because they've got their dogs, I guess, in their fights when it comes to proprietary software and things like that, that they want to make sure they have control over, too. So even though Steve Jobs released that statement about, well, HTML5 is coming out, so we don't have to worry about Flash anymore, and even though that's relatively true, as it turns out, Safari is not as on board with some of these things as I would have thought. But to the extent that you want to try to get the most out of it, Chrome, Opera, the Opera's still around. It's making a comeback. It's actually pretty cool. It does some cool stuff. I'll show you in a little bit. So there's this one. And these are in the references I'll show you, so don't worry about necessarily about the URLs. The HTML5test.com. This is a way you can keep up with what elements are supported in the browser that you currently have. It'll check it out and it'll give you a score. So you can actually take a look at what your support level is for many of these elements. I'm actually going to talk about the canvas. I'm going to talk about video. So you see your video support and you see, like, I guess, container and codec support or something like that. So MPEG-4 support for Chrome, which is what I'm using right now? Nope. But it does have that OGG Theora support and that WebM support, that open source codec, this WebM, I guess, format that uses the OGG codecs. And again, this is a bit of an alphabet soup here, so I'm not going to get too deep into that. But because I'll end up saying the wrong thing. I'll get it wrong. But that WebM, now a lot of people support that video. Chrome, Firefox, Opera, Internet Explorer 9 does. In fact, the only person who doesn't, and that's with a caveat, the Internet Explorer 9, but they do offer some provisional support. The only person who does so far is Safari. You still have to use that H.264 MP4 container, whatever. But again, you basically, if you can just do those two encodings, you encode it twice, your video has native support in pretty much every major browser. You don't have to go to Flash. You don't have to install a Flash plugin. Of course, that's been incorporated on some level, more so than it used to, but it's still not nearly as good as having the browser be able to render and read these things. Let's see. When can I use? Can I use.com? Here's another one. Go to the index, and HTML5 support gives you a chart of when these elements are supported by what browsers. So you see with the color coding over there, the light green is, I think, partial support. The deeper fluorescent-looking green is full support, and of course the red and the pink are problems. But if you notice, for example, audio, the only browser you would have a problem with that would not support audio right now is Opera Mini, which I think 0 people use. Right? I mean, I looked at it once, but it's a little frustrating. But everybody else, assuming you get that codec thing right, assuming you know what you're talking about with the containers and the codecs, and just you know the minimum that you need to know, you have full audio support in the browsers right now, as of today. If everybody's using at least, you know, Internet Explorer 9 or Firefox 3.6 or Safari 4.0 or Chrome 10. So if you go back the last few versions of a lot of these browsers, you actually have support for these audio tags. So these are some good elements to get you started figuring out how you want to incorporate HTML5. This last one I'll show you here before I move back on to the demonstration, if I can find my mouse. Where's my mouse? Oh, of course I'm live, so there we go. My loading time froze, but we're good. Periodic table of the elements, I thought this was pretty neat. Some innovatively, I guess, thinking dude created this periodic table that shows you there's a color code somewhere around here. It's at the bottom. So if you can, I'll zoom in and then scroll down. And so you can see root elements, metadata scripting, forms. So you see what they are, like what the elements are and what they're designed to do. And there are a lot of new cool form elements out there that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But these are some, and these are all in the references here on my webpage. But these are some of the things to help kind of get you started on that. As far as backward compatibility goes, and I was just talking about that, there's support that the level of support, full support for a lot of these things does vary. But one thing that doesn't vary is that HTML5 was designed specifically with the idea in mind that they didn't want to break any more pages. I think what happened a long time ago is that the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, they wanted to go through XML because they wanted pages to validate properly, and it was all stuff that I guess is way beyond the scope of what we want to talk about. But using that pure XML would start breaking web pages because if you didn't put your closing tag or something in the right spot, your entire page wouldn't work, and so it would render your page inoperable. So people didn't like that, of course, and so they stayed with older HTML and never got on track with that, which is sort of what created a lot of the problems, because you don't care if you forgot a closing element if your page works fine. That might matter theoretically on some higher level, but on a practical level, you want your page to work. So HTML5 will work. It's simpler. It's actually streamlined, and I'll show you that as far as like how do you code it. We're about to go into that. In fact, I think I'm running a little over longer than I wanted to on this part because I did want to get into some of these things. But it does have backward functionality with, I guess, what we would call legacy browser versions. So if the worst that will happen if you include an HTML5 element is that you just won't get maybe the support for it, but it won't cause a problem. Like if you want to use a form field that auto-focuses, so that it puts the cursor in there when the web page opens, which HTML5 allows you to do. If it's an older browser that doesn't support it, it just won't autofocus. So that's what you're left with trying to deal with. It doesn't actually cause a problem for the form. So none of these issues, so using HTML5 and coding with it and creating, I guess, a valid HTML5 page is not going to create a problem. In fact, that's what we're going to get into right now is the minimum code necessary to have an HTML5 page. Okay, so what do you need? Well, you always have to declare a doc type, which is now we're going to actually get into doing some of the coding. So we'll go to this trial here. Okay, the first thing you need is this, Doctype Html. Now, and that's it, by the way. You don't have to use, I know that when you use some of the websites before, it was HTML, XML 4.01, and then it was the web address, and then it was some other kind of a support link. None of that's necessary anymore. All you need to do is just stick HTML5 up there, Doctype Html5. Well, actually HTML. And it will validate as an HTML5 page to the browser. Next thing you want to do is you want to specify a language. You still want to specify a language. Mostly that's for, like, I guess, screen readers and things like that. So, it says the word 6 properly if somebody's using it, that kind of thing. So, like different spellings, different languages, pronunciations, and things like that. So you do want to specify your language in your HTML tag. And then your character set, UTF-8, I guess that's the super standard or whatever. You still want to specify that for those reasons. But once you do that, you have a valid HTML5 page. That's all you've got to stick on there. There's nothing else. There's no other like XML, blah, blah, blah. It will read it as valid HTML text. That's it. Now this part right here, of course, is Internet Explorer again. Oh, yes, sir.
I was just wondering whether that meta statement should be inside the head element, or is it? So the doc type and the HTML are above the head element, and then the meta.
You can stick it above the head or below the head. As far as my knowing what exactly happens if you stick it above the head or below the head, I don't, but I know that I've seen it done both ways. As far as the meta, yeah, I guess a lot of people see it outside of the head, but sticking it in the head also is legitimate. This element here is the only JavaScript, unfortunately, that you need, because Internet Explorer, for some reason, has a hard time recognizing some of these new HTML elements, so you have to do what's called a shiv. And some of these HTML5 developers created this, and basically all it does is if you have Internet Explorer 9, if the browser, or if the page opens up in 9, it reads that script and creates those elements uses JavaScript to basically create those elements in the browser's DOM, and its document object model, which, again, I'm talking about the DOMs a little sort of beyond the scope of this thing too, because that gets a little tricky. But that's where a lot of this is important is because that's how the browser knows how to handle it. So when you use your CSS and you use your jQuery for things like that to control your elements, how it's represented in the browser's DOM is what makes the difference. And so this little script enables Internet Explorer to handle those new elements. Yeah?
Does not affect performance?
No, it's so minimal, it does not affect the performance. And it is a frustrating thing to deal with Internet Explorer. We have to deal with it. So you're going to have JavaScript no matter what in some of these elements, and especially compared to what you would have to do to create the functionality if you didn't have it in there. But we're talking about like 4 or 5 little statements. Like if you actually saw because this is just the link to the guy who created it, but if you ever go look at it, and you will, I'll actually give you the link to this guy's page. What it actually is created is just really a list of like, create header, create footer, create element this, and that's it. So it just tells Internet Explorer to just create those elements. And it doesn't, there's really no drag, there's no loading issue or anything like that. But that is basically it. That is exactly what you need to do to create your HTML5 valid page. And that's way simpler, way cleaner, way easier than it currently is and it used to be. All right. And so that's it. And that's what this shiv, they call it for Internet Explorer. But once you do that, you're up and running. Now let's talk about some of these new features, okay, and actually implementing them. I already talked a little bit about the header and the footer and the aside and the nav, and so I'm not going to dwell on that. But this new content, it gives the semantic meaning to the page, makes it look better. The browser can, again, incorporate it into what they call the DOM. It's DOM or whatever. There's also another element that I want to focus on specifically called the time pub date element. That's a brand new element, and this allows you to do something that you could not previously do, which is apparently tell the computer what time something had happened. It would just read the text. You stick it in a p tag or something, and it would just display text. Now, and I'll show you the example from my HTML5 test, you can actually tell the browser the machine code time. So that, and you have to put it in the machine code here in the tag, but when you stick it in there, it does actually identify the date now, which is good for, say, syndication, for example. When you're doing updates, you do an update on your page, you change that time code or whatever, the computer picks up the time change. You don't have to do it's able to automate it better. And so this is the machine-readable date, which is June 25th, 2011. I guess that's -5, Zulu time or something. So that'll be noon our time, daylight, if you're accounting for daylight savings time or something, right? Well, I think it's -6 without daylight, right? And then we go an hour ahead. So, but anyway, I'm 5 or 6, depending on the time of year, that this would be a correct date. And the machine can actually read the time now. So I know that doesn't seem so fancy and awesome and doesn't wow anybody, but that's actually a pretty big step forward with, again, allowing the web browser to do what it was designed to do, which is interpret your page correctly and give that information correctly. So let's go look at some of the form elements. I'm also using a neat attribute here that I'll show you. So let me open up. So let's actually start looking at some of these things. Okay, so I did one of those, I guess, like in the oven, like the cooking shows, where you kind of like, you show how we do it and then you whip the thing out. So in 30 minutes you get the souffle. This is kind of that. So I just put a skeleton of, say, a web page using some of these elements here, and we'll take a look at how some of these features work. So, okay, let's take a look at the forms. I'll go to my HTML code here. I have, if you notice it says hidden right there, that's a new HTML5 attribute that will actually hide elements from display. So you can stick that in the attribute and it will not show anymore. So I will erase it and I will refresh. And we'll take a look at the forms. If you notice the first thing, it auto-focused. It went straight to that. That's HTML. That's not JavaScript. It auto-focuses on your form. The second thing you notice, if you look, there's actual, take a look, there, placeholder text. That's another HTML5 attribute. So let's see, I've got some of these up here. Where's my presentation now? Let's go back to my presentation. So you've got these Form inputs, URL, email, date, time. So, and this is where I'll show you this in a second. So when you see this where it says email, telephone number, that actually is the type now. It used to just be type text, and you'd enter the text, and then you'd put your JavaScript on top of that in order for people to understand if it's an HTML, if it's an email block box. Now you don't need to do that. Now you have input type email. Placeholder, just type whatever you want in the placeholder text to render it. Let's see, I'll go back. So, whatever you type here, info here, and I'll go back to that, and see it changes there. Whatever you could, that's how you handle your form now. You actually don't need JavaScript to do it. All you got to do is create the element, placeholder, put your placeholder text in there. Again, you can make it autofocus on what you want to, so you can start typing. And that's an improvement over using the JavaScript. The date field. Now, this is something that's a little progressive that unfortunately not everybody is on board with, but I wish they were. And this is something that Opera does really well, is they actually incorporate a date picker into the date field. So if you create a form element and you call it type date, Opera will render a date picker for you. So you don't have to do any JavaScript for your date pickers now. That actually gets rendered in browsers. I say not now, not in Opera. Apparently it's a little ahead of the game. Now Chrome, if you want to see how that compares with some of these other ones, Chrome actually supports it too, but it's only partial. It's only slight, but it does give you the date. But Opera, yeah, they even go a little bit crazier with it. They even have a color picker field. So if you want to create a form and for some reason you need to give somebody a color element, they can choose that. And that is, again, native in the browser and the HTML5. The only thing you need to do is do input type and then call it color. And Opera's got a color picker. Now this stuff is a little more progressive than that, but these are the interesting kind of cool things that HTML, more progressive than what a lot of the other browsers are doing, but these are the cool, interesting things that you're able to do with HTML5, and this is like a little farther ahead. But you can still do it with some of this stuff with what we call fallbacks, a Polyfill, and I'll show you a couple of websites about how to incorporate that too. Here's another cool element that apparently, for some reason, it's a little more technical than what I think a lot of us would care about. But it is something that all the browsers support, and it's the canvas element, which is you're able to render graphics now in the browser without actually having to import any kind of an image or without having to import any other kind of a graphics editor and use that. You can actually do that. Now it does require JavaScript to do it, and I'll show you what it is in the code. But and it's this right here, so it's not like it's the easiest. Yeah, yes, sir. Okay.
How to process that data? What's the action? What do you do with that?
Okay, now that you're still left with your PHP if you want to process the data. You're still going to have to just create, like a PHP program that will recognize form. It increases the functionality. Well, here's another thing. Here's something. Let me go back to the form really quickly then, because there is something that I guess I did want to hit on that I didn't quite go. Let me go to a trial here. And so let's say you make a form. All right. Form. Input. Let's say type. Email. All right. And we'll give it the attribute required, and then we'll input type equals submit, value equals go. All right, and let's open this up in Chrome and see what happens. So local host HTML5. And I think that was what trial. So now it's required. So you see, this is Chrome doing this right here. This isn't quite answering your question, but I want to show some of this functionality that it does. Actually, you used to have to use JavaScript, or before HTML5, you'd have to use JavaScript if you wanted to force the person to validate or in a required field. Now with Chrome and Opera, of course, they have the support, and then other people are coming along. But HTML5 does that for you. It tells you didn't fill out the field. So it does a lot of the scripting. Unfortunately, if you want to process the form, that's a little bit of a different situation that I would be happy to talk about. Yeah. Because the processing it, of course, you're going to have to do something like whenever you want to process your forms, which is a big pain, which I'd actually be happy to talk about. But you'd have to do the action, which would be post or whatever, or I'm sorry, the method would be post. All right. And then the action would be some PHP process.php thing. And then whatever PHP code you have, we have to process it, of course. That's still, you still got to do that. But again, you don't need the JavaScript for the validation in HTML5. It's not 100% along yet, but that is what HTML5 does allow you to do. Back on the Canvas thing, this is a little technical, but it's kind of fun to look at. Is you can actually, again, you can draw graphics on the fly. If somebody knows a little bit of JavaScript, the browser renders them on the fly. It doesn't actually have to do anything special. So here, I'll just change these colors here for this gradient. I happen to know my school colors in hexadecimal, which is 003366. And it should render it properly. Let's see, we are live here, so let's just reload the page. Local HTML5. Test HTML, and see, yeah, now you're able to. You can even save this and use. Like I've been able to do that. I've been able to like create a graphic with this and then save it and use it. Now, why would you want to go through all the trouble with all the other software there? That's something that's down the road. But the browser has the ability to do this neat kind of stuff, so that you have this functionality that you used to have to reserve to other parties. All right, and so I think the last thing, let's go back to the presentation outline so we can stay on target. And we've got a few more minutes here. Okay. Form input types, so Canvas, it allows for this dynamic rendering of shapes and images in the web browser. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what we want to talk about. I just want to make sure that you know that it's there, that it's fully supported. And then you got audio and video. And again, this enables the browser to play the files. You don't need the third-party software. This is a bit of a this is a simplification here, but it seems like it's going in this direction. So like, as of today, there may be a glitch or two. You want to look at this. But if you basically encode your video in an MP4 and WebM, and or use the container and code it whatever those containers read or whatever, like I guess encode it in H.264 or whatever, and the WebM format, which is the Vorbis, which is OGG or something. If you encode your video in those two things, you should basically have browser support. Now with Internet Explorer, unfortunately, what it requires you to do is download a codec, but you can actually put that into the video tag, and I'll show you. So if it doesn't show it, it'll actually say download the codec or download the latest version of the browser. So you can actually tell the person what they need to do in order to play it, which is no different from what they'd have to do if they didn't have the Flash anyway. Then they have to go to Adobe's site, download Flash, install it, restart their browser, and all that. In this, all they've got to do is just download the proper codec. So for WebM support, actually, you know what? Actually, that's not for the H.264. That's actually for the WebM support for IE9. So IE9 does support M4, but they've actually got on board with WebM with that caveat that you download that codec, that plugin or whatever. So even if you just use WebM, now the only person out there who doesn't support it is Safari. So you would still have to do the MP4 basically, but then it's going to show up on your Safari iOS. You don't have to worry about whatever the agreements are with other vendors. You don't have to worry about Flash for the iPhone. It actually works with the HTML5 source element if you do that encoding. So there is an extra step with the video encoding. Audio, it's the same thing, basically MP3, which is proprietary, and this OGG container, which is not. You do need to convert these files. There are a number of converters that you can find. One that I actually like to use a lot on Windows for audio conversion, and I'll show you an example here, is Audacity. Audacity will convert your MP3 file to the OGG file pretty easy. I think if you want to convert it, because MP3 is proprietary, you actually have to download a plugin to Audacity to do it, because that's how it gets complicated there. But if you start out with an MP3 file, you can convert it to the OGG file with no problem. In fact, I converted this one. It's not hard. All you do is you click File, Export. Export is OGG of Orbis, and click Save. And you do your metadata there, and that's it. And then it does the rest for you. It takes a few seconds, and it creates you an OGG file. So then you can embed it. Now, in fact, we'll look at that right now. So let's open up Chrome here and go to our HTML5 test page. And let's unlock. I have it hidden, so I'll unlock it. And we'll go over the controls really quickly, actually, now that we'll think about it. I'll go over the tags before we open it up. So here's how you do it with HTML5. You just write audio tag. You type controls. You can actually type in an autoplay, so it starts playing and no controls, so it'll start playing and you can't stop it. I don't know why you would want to do that to your user, but you can do that. But if you can also, you have a few other attributes that you can stick on there, and I guess we got to do both sides here. Sorry, I'll try to get back. So you can actually, sitting over there is like this controls element here. You can actually, there are a few different attributes that you can give an audio or video. One is the control, so they show up, but you can say autoplay, for example, and then take the controls off, and then it'll just start playing the file, and then nobody knows where it's coming from or how to deal with it. So you do want the controls up there. You can style it. You style the size, the height, the width, just like you style other HTML5 elements. And you've got other features too, like you can do progressive load, so that actually it loads a little bit, it buffers before it starts playing the file. And you know, a lot of the video conversion stuff you probably want to look into separately, because there's so many other things that go on. Because not only do you have the codecs, but you do have different file sizes for different browsers and users and things like that you're going to be concerned about, like file quality and things like that. That is its own separate issue, right, as far as making good files. But for the HTML part, it's not hard. You create your sample, you create your file, you create your source, sample.ogg. If I needed to do the MP3 part, here's exactly how you do that. As many sources as you have that you might need for the browser, source equals sample.mp3, type equals mp3, let's see, audio mp3, and that's it. So if the browser, and it will go down like this. So if the browser reads, if it's able to play the OGG file, it'll read the OGG file. If the browser is able to play the MP3 file, it'll skip the OGG and play the MP3. So you don't have to worry about what kind of support you've got for that. It'll do it. And if it doesn't, then you write in here, your browser does not support this function. You know, download the latest version or something like that. You know, download the latest version. Huh? Sucka. Sucka. But it does not support the latest function. And so I'll unhide the browser and the video, the audio and the video there. We'll save it. And wow, we're almost done here. Sorry, I always end up going longer than I think I will on some of these things. But this is actual native support here. And so, you know, you hit play. Yeah. And it's one of my favorite songs. And it's some video I was able to convert to WebM. That actually plays sports. There's no third-party plugin required for any of this. And if you right-click, and the cool thing about WebM, or maybe not cool, depending on how you look at it, is that because it's open source, you know, they play it on like YouTube and stuff, you can only embed links. People can actually download the video files from this thing. So if you actually have it playing and they want to download it, they can just right-click, save video as, and save the video. Now maybe you don't want them to be able to download it, and then you got to worry about that as far as licensing goes. But you actually have this open source. It's not limited by anybody. Even that H.2.6 thing, that's a proprietary format. But you're able, and this is what it looks like in Opera. the video and the multimedia. And that's your player, and that's your video player. And you can even size the heck out of it. So watch, we'll take our video piece of code there. We'll paste it in this trial page where we did the form. We'll open up the trial page. Okay, we got our video, great. And we can like resize the mess out of this. So watch this. We'll just we'll make this width 1200 pixels. Yeah. You can make it so that the user can, of course, control it, just like you could if you wanted to be able to make him be able to do some of the other elements. But that's just a little bit. Again, some of it's difficult for me to kind of gauge how much to talk about on some of these elements, because these are really cool, and I'm only touching on them. I'm not actually going into enough detail to make it practical, but I want to be able to get it. But you could, of course, just like you can with other controls, so they can resize text and things like that. You can simply easily make them able to resize the video. But if you wanted to double it, you could, and of course now it's huge. And it's bigger than we need for the screen, but it's there. And that movie's rated R, so don't take your kids to see it. But and I think that's about it on the cool elements that I wanted to sort of give a survey of. Compatibility issues. There are basically two things you need to know about browser compatibility to get started. One is this piece of JavaScript called Modernizer. Again, and you still really can't get away from the JavaScript. And I'll open that up. What Modernizer does, and it's a little bit technical using, but it basically detects the browser support. And so if you ended up incorporating some of these things, like these form fields, and the browser was an old browser and didn't support it, then it would detect it, and it would go to a fallback. So you would say in your either detect this element, like video or something, and if it doesn't detect it, then use Flash or something like that. So that's what Modernizer does, and a lot of this is basically the standard that anybody who's using HTML5 now to code, the companies that do a lot of the work with this, are using Modernizer. It's a small script. You stick it in the head of your file, and it helps you detect the support. The browser doesn't do anything. It doesn't create the support. That's for my second site here, but it does detect it. And doing that, then what you want is to, in order to make sure it's 100%, and this is just the headache part of it until all this gets filled in, you do what's called a polyfill. And there is a website, and I hope you guys don't object to strong language, because there happens to be strong language on the site, unfortunately. But it is pretty effective. It's a group of open source coders, and so it is all you need for HTML fallbacks. So, like, basically you can copy and paste your scripts here for the things that you want to use. So, for example, the Canvas support, video support, the web forms, we were talking about that, making this web form stuff work in some of these older browsers. You've got a lot of options right up here to look at some cut and paste options to be able to do it, so you don't have to be like a JavaScript coder in order to be able to use these elements, but then I guess make it compatible enough with the older browsers that it doesn't break or anything like that. So I guess that's basically it. In fact, I've taken up a lot of time, more than I thought I would. These are the references that I used. I suppose I'll make them available to anybody if they want them, the links. These are all the links. If you do, let me know, and I'll make them available. I'll put them up on my personal website and give you a web address to it, so you can just click. Yeah.
Some of them into the session description.
The session description? You mean like re-add it to the session? Oh, sure. Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Then I'll just re-add these to the session. I'll just do that then. So I'll re-add these links into the session description when you go to the CALI website, so that they'll be there. But this is sort of, I keep pointing, I always do this thing. But the references part, these websites are basically all you would need to get started implementing it, if so you wanted to do, or wanted to direct somebody who was going to be using it. And so you know a little bit more about it. I guess I have time for a question or two. Yeah.
Question, comment, kind of thing. With the browser support, I work in academia. We have professors who have persons or something like that when you're dealing with a less sophisticated audience.
Yeah, and unfortunately that is a problem. But as far as the codec goes and the Adobe Flash thing goes, I mean, Flash got there somehow, you know. And the thing about being able to use when you're looking at mobile browsers and things like that, that's where the video element really comes in handy. So you're always going to have that problem anytime you start making these changes about supporting the old system, the old users, but trying to move forward in the less painful way possible. And so these are the ways to do that, although, yeah, they're not all, you know, no, I guess one solution is going to be satisfactory, unfortunately, and you're not going to be able to get everybody on the same page. But that's it. Anything else? Okay, well, all right, thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Hope you got something out of that. Thanks a lot.